a shocking trial that shook everyone. After his mother's death, her son tries to prove that his stepfather, who cheated on his wife during her battle with illness, is not entitled to the inheritance. But is moral decline enough for the law to recognize him as unworthy? The evidence reveals the secrets of the family drama, the witnesses shock with their confessions, and the end of the case proves that truth and justice are not always the same. Chapter 1. Opening of the case. The Supreme Court of the State of New York has started another hearing. In a spacious hall lit by large windows, the participants of the case, which has already managed to cause a stir in the local media, gathered. On the plaintiff's bench is 16-year-old Ethan Brooks, a boy with sharp features that betray his weariness and inner tension. His lawyer, Sarah Collins, a middle-aged woman in a sharp black suit, was checking the notes. On the defendant's bench is Richard Wilson, a 45-year-old man with bald patches and a smug smile. His dark gray suit fit perfectly, as did his self-righteousness. Next to him sat his lawyer, Mark Green, known for his unscrupulousness in the defense of clients. The courtroom fell silent when the door opened and Judge Jonathan Reeves, a stern man with gray temples who hated idle chatter, walked confidently into the room. His gaze ran around the hall, appraising those present. "I ask everyone to stand up," the voice of the court secretary rang out. When everyone rose, the judge slowly lowered himself into his seat and opened the case. The Supreme Court of the State of New York declares an open hearing in case #2025/47, Ethan Brooks v. Richard Wilson. The plaintiff alleges that the defendant has no right to claim the inheritance of his late mother, Olivia Brooks, due to immoral conduct and neglect of her life and health. The defendant, in turn, filed a counterclaim, accusing the plaintiff of intentionally causing him grievous bodily harm. Are the parties ready to begin? Sarah Collins stood up, looking at her client, who was clenching his fists nervously. "Yes, Your Honor, the plaintiff is ready." Mark Green nodded. "Your Honor, the defense is also ready." The judge looked intently at Ethan and then at his stepfather. "This is not a television show and not a family quarrel," he pointed out sternly. "This is a court, and I demand clear facts, evidence, and respect for the process from all participants. If anyone thinks they can manipulate justice, let them leave those illusions now." Ethan swallowed barely perceptibly. His lawyer put her hand on his shoulder, reminding him to hold on. Richard, on the other hand, looked self-confident, as if it was just a formality. He knew the law was on his side. The judge turned to the first page of the case and said, "The plaintiff can make an opening statement." Chapter 2. Testimony of the plaintiff Ethan Brooks. Judge Jonathan Reeves tapped his gavel on the lectern, drawing attention. "Plaintiff, you have the floor." Ethan Brooks stood up. His palms were slightly sweaty, but his voice was steady, albeit a little shaky. He looked at the judge, then at his stepfather, who was sitting with an easy smile. He wanted to shout, to prove that this man is a liar, a manipulator, but he knew. Here everything is decided by words and facts. "Your Honor," Ethan began, "I don't just want this man to be denied my mother's inheritance. I want you to understand who he really is. Richard Wilson is not the man who loved my mother. He used her while she was alive and betrayed her when she was dying." The judge nodded, inviting him to continue. "When my mother learned about her diagnosis, she was stunned. But she fought. She worked 2 jobs to support us while Richard just stayed at home. He did not work, did not help her, did not take her to the doctor. He was only in the hospital twice, and that was because she insisted. I remember her tears as she begged him to at least make dinner when she came home exhausted from chemotherapy. But he didn't care. Dinner was ordered at a restaurant with her money while he played video games or idled around." Ethan paused to catch his breath. He noticed Richard roll his eyes, as if the words didn't affect him at all. "And then I found out about the betrayal." Ethan's voice trembled, but he quickly pulled himself together. "One day I came home early and found him in bed with our neighbor, Linda Peterson. And not just in bed. In my mother's bed, a woman who was currently undergoing chemotherapy. Can you imagine how I felt?" A few whispers were heard in the hall. The judge looked at Richard. "Defendant, do not pretend that this does not concern you." I want to hear the answer to these accusations, but later. Plaintiff, proceed. Ethan sighed and lifted his head higher. I could not tell my mother. I didn't want to upset her. But she found out. I don't know what one of the neighbors said. She cried all night. 2 weeks later, she died. I believe that this man killed her morally, destroyed her will to live. And now he wants to get her apartment. He has no right to it. Ethan paused, caught his breath. The judge made a few notes in his folder. Thank you, Mr. Brooks. Does your attorney have anything to add? Sarah Collins stood up. Your Honor, we have evidence that confirms my client's words. We will present the affidavits of the neighbors, the tape of the conversation with Linda Peterson, and the financial documents proving that the defendant was living off the late Olivia Brooks. There are also medical records confirming the condition of Miss Brooks before her death. The judge looked at the defendant's lawyer. The defendant will have the opportunity to answer. This concludes the first stage of hearing the plaintiff. Let's continue with the testimony of the defendant. Ethan sat up, anger burning in his chest. He did everything he could. Now the case is before the court. Chapter 3. Testimony of the defendant Richard Wilson. There was a tense silence in the courtroom. Richard Wilson sat in his seat, tapping his fingers nervously on the table. He waited for Judge Reeves to give him the floor. His lawyer, Mark Green, whispered something quietly in his ear, but Richard just shrugged and sighed theatrically. The judge rapped his gavel, attracting attention. Now the floor is given to the defendant. Mr. Wilson, you may state your position. Richard straightened up, straightened the lapels of his jacket, and spoke with feigned confidence. Your Honor, I am here to defend my name from absurd accusations. I understand that Ethan is angry, he is grieving the loss of his mother, but that does not give him the right to slander me. He looked at Ethan, a barely concealed triumph in his eyes. I was a good husband for Olivia. I tried to support her as much as I could. Yes, she worked, but it was her choice. She was a strong woman and never allowed me to interfere in her financial affairs. We agreed that she works because she wants to, and I do the housework. And it was her initiative, not mine. Richard abruptly paused, giving the court time to consider his words. Judge Reeves nodded calmly. And what do you say about her illness? How exactly did you support her? Richard sighed, tilting his head in mock sympathy. Your Honor, it was a difficult period for all of us. I understand that Ethan thinks I'm indifferent, but he doesn't know the whole truth. I did accompany Olivia to the hospital, but she asked me not to come to all her chemotherapy sessions. She wanted me to stay at home, take care of the apartment, and cook. I didn't see the point of sitting in the hospital corridor if I couldn't help. Ethan clenched his fists, but remained silent. What about betrayal? Asked attorney Sarah Collins, crossing her arms over her chest. Do you deny the fact that Ethan caught you with Linda Peterson in his mother's bed? Richard huffed and pretended to be deep in thought. Linda is an old friend of mine. Yes, we spent time together. But I never cheated on Olivia. These are all made up by Ethan, who is looking for an excuse to make me look bad. She came to me because she needed help, and the guy exaggerated everything. An indignant whisper was heard in the hall. The judge rapped his gavel again. Mr. Wilson, let's stick to the facts. And the last question, what was the reason for the conflict between you and Ethan after which he attacked you? Richard pretended to shrug. He always hated me. From the first day, I became part of their family. He threatened me, called me names, and wrote offensive messages. And that day, he just broke down. I made a remark to him about studying, and he pounced on me like a wild animal, caused me serious injuries, and now he wants to expose himself as a victim. This is funny. The judge looked at Ethan, then at the lawyers. Okay, I heard your position. We will consider the evidence from both sides before making a decision. The court will continue the case. Richard sat down, glancing smugly at Ethan. He was sure that his version sounded convincing. But will this be enough to avoid the consequences? Chapter 4. Evidence and Witnesses. Judge Reeves tapped his gavel in a call to order. The moment came when the words of the parties had to be confirmed or refuted by evidence. The lawyers recalled every detail, every document that could change the course of the process. The court will hear the evidence, the judge announced. The first word is given to the plaintiff. Miss Collins, please. Sarah Collins stood up, calmly spreading the papers in front of her. Your Honor, we have several witnesses who can confirm the words of my client. But first I want to present the physical evidence. She nodded to her assistant, who handed the file to the judge. There are bank statements here showing that Richard Wilson has made no financial contributions to Olivia Brooks' housing, utilities, or medical care for the past 2 years. All expenses fell exclusively on her shoulders. The judge reviewed the documents and handed them over to the secretary. Further, we have the testimony of the neighbors. Please call Mrs. Linda Peterson. A 45-year-old woman with short, cropped brown hair entered the hall. She looked uncomfortable, nervously running her fingers over the hem of her blouse. Mrs. Peterson, Collins began, can you confirm or deny the fact that you had a relationship with the defendant, Mr. Wilson? Linda sighed and nodded. Yes, we had a relationship. They started even before Olivia got to the hospital. I understand that it was wrong, but he told me that their marriage had long since broken up, that they lived as neighbors. Ethan clenched his fists at the words. He knew it was a lie, and Linda knew it. Is it true that Ethan found you together at his mother's house? Collins continued. Linda closed her eyes as if trying to erase the memories. Yes, he broke into the room when we were together. He was furious, but it can be understood. Mother was in the hospital, and Richard was having fun. The judge listened attentively, noting what was said. Thank you, Mrs. Peterson, he said. You can return to your place. Collins motioned to another witness. Olivia's neighbor, Mrs. Doris Fletcher, an elderly woman with a penetrating look, entered the hall. Mrs. Fletcher, you were acquainted with the late Olivia Brooks for a long time. Can you tell the court what her last months were like? The woman shook her head sadly. She was exhausted, but she fought. She said that she wanted to live for the sake of her son. But in recent weeks, she looked even worse. I asked what happened, and she just cried. I think she knew about the betrayal, she just couldn't go through with it. Richard grimaced, but didn't say a word. The judge reviewed the documents once more and returned to the defense. Attorney Green, do you have evidence that refutes this testimony? Mark Green stood up, looked at his client, and nodded. Now is their time to play their cards. Chapter 5. Court Debates. Judge Reeves turned to the last page of his docket and tapped his gavel in a call to order. The court proceeds to the final debate. Both sides will have an opportunity to present their final arguments before a decision is made. Sarah Collins, the plaintiff's attorney, slowly stood up. She paused, letting her words take over the room. Your Honor, her voice sounded firm, this trial is not only about money, not only about inheritance. He is about justice. My client, Ethan Brooks, lost his mother. He was left alone, without support. And in front of you sits a person who not only did not support him, but on the contrary betrayed his mother's trust, took advantage of her defenselessness, and ruined her last days. Collins paused, looking in Richard Wilson's direction. We provided the court with evidence that the defendant did not make any efforts to help his wife. We have seen bank statements which show that all expenses were borne by the late Olivia. We heard the testimony of neighbors who confirmed that she knew about the betrayal and was morally broken by it. We heard from Mrs. Linda Peterson, who openly admitted that her relationship with the defendant began before Olivia's death. All of this shows a true picture of who Mr. Wilson is. She looked at the judge and then at Ethan, who was sitting with a tense expression on his face. My client is not perfect. He is young and made a mistake by succumbing to his emotions when he attacked the defendant. But he did not act out of selfish motives. He did not try to appropriate the inheritance. His only goal was to protect his mother's memory. I ask the court to consider all the evidence presented and find that Mr. Wilson does not deserve the right to inherit. The judge nodded. Thank you, Miss Collins. Mr. Green, I now call you. Mark Green stood up, adjusted the cuffs of his expensive suit, and looked confidently out into the hall. Your Honor, he began, my colleague plays the emotional card perfectly. Yes, this case is sympathetic, and I understand the plaintiff's anger. But we are in a courtroom where not emotions decide, but the law. He walked along the table, his voice sounding calm and thoughtful. The fact remains, Olivia Brooks did not deprive my client of the right to inheritance. She did not file for divorce or make a will that would exclude Mr. Wilson. On the contrary, she left him an equal right to the property. The law does not provide for punishment for immoral behavior in inheritance matters. If we make decisions based on emotions today, we will set a dangerous precedent. He stopped, enduring a dramatic pause. In addition, my client was a victim of violence by Ethan Brooks. We have medical documents confirming the serious bodily injuries caused by the plaintiff. And yes, Mr. Brooks claims it was an outburst of emotion, but the law does not justify violence. Do we want to send a message to society that violence can be justified by anger? I think not. Green looked at the judge again. Your Honor, please do not give in to emotions and make a decision based on the law. My client has a legal right to inherit, and we are asking the court to leave it to him. The judge listened attentively, without showing what he was thinking. He tapped the hammer again. Thank you, Mr. Green. The court adjourns before rendering its decision. The courtroom fell silent as the judge stood up and headed for his room. The last word had been said, and now all that remained was to wait for the verdict. Chapter 6. Court Verdict. There was tense silence in the courtroom. Everyone sat still, waiting for Judge Jonathan Reeves to return. Ethan clenched his fingers into a fist nervously, trying to hide his excitement. Richard, on the other hand, sat with a smug smile, confident in his own victory. The door opened, and the judge took his seat. He glanced briefly at both sides and tapped the hammer. The court has made a decision. His voice was calm, but authoritative. After careful consideration of the evidence and testimony, the court concluded that Ethan Brooks did not have a selfish motive in his actions and did not seek to take over his mother's inheritance by eliminating the defendant. His actions were the result of a great mental upheaval, but they did not affect his right to inherit. Therefore, the claim that Mr. Wilson is an unfit heir is dismissed. It seemed to Ethan that the ground was falling from under his feet. He gritted his teeth, trying to hide his disappointment. Richard gave a small chuckle, crossing his arms over his chest in satisfaction. The judge continued. At the same time, the court believes that the actions of Mr. Wilson, although immoral, do not violate the current legislation on inheritance. His actions can be condemned from an ethical point of view, but the law does not regulate the moral aspects of human relations. Accordingly, the counterclaim declaring Ethan Brooks to be an unfit heir is also dismissed. Richard lifted his chin even higher, his smile even wider, but the judge did not let him enjoy the moment. However, the court cannot ignore the social consequences of this case. Due to the fact that Mr. Wilson did not provide adequate support to his wife during her illness and actually neglected his duties, the court leaves the moral assessment of his actions to society. Disgruntled whispers were heard in the hall. Many took this as an unspoken condemnation of Richard, even if the law could not punish him. The judge rapped his gavel. At this point, the court session is declared closed. I ask everyone to stand up, announced the court secretary. Richard stood up, still maintaining his smug posture. But when he looked at Ethan, he saw in his eyes not defeat, but something else: determination. The boy was not going to put up with such a result. He couldn't change the court's verdict, but he sure could control his own destiny. It's not the end yet, Ethan whispered quietly, leaving the hall. Richard felt a slight thrill run up his spine. He may have won in court, but will he win in life? Chapter 7. Afterward. A New York morning greeted Ethan with a cool wind and bright rays of sunlight breaking through the skyscrapers. He stood on the courthouse steps, watching reporters with cameras surround Richard Wilson. He was smiling in all directions, waving his arms as if it was his personal victory. Mr. Wilson, what do you say about today's court decision? Asked one of the reporters, raising the microphone. Richard squared his shoulders, feigning confidence. The law won, he said. I never doubted that justice would be on my side. After all, it was obvious. Ethan, who was standing nearby, just shook his head. He didn't need to say anything. His mother left, and the court, as usual, remained indifferent to the true essence of the events. The law worked only within the letter, without regard for morality or true human worth. Sarah Collins came out of the building and stopped next to him. "You behaved yourself, Ethan," she said, looking into his tense face. "The court does not always make decisions that we like. But this does not mean that the struggle is over." The guy didn't answer right away. He looked into the distance, where the silhouette of their apartment could be seen among the gray buildings. The memories of his mother were still there, but now they belonged to more than just him. "I don't want to fight for this apartment anymore," he finally said. "She will be empty without her mother, and let him take her if it is so important to him." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "And what will you do next?" Ethan allowed himself a small smile for the first time in a long time. "I will start from scratch. I don't know where I'll go, but I'm definitely not going to live in the shadow of this story. He may have an apartment, but he won't get my future." Richard finally spotted Ethan in the crowd and approached with a triumphant look. "Well, boy," he said with a mischievous smile, "maybe you will apologize for all those accusations that did not help you." Ethan looked him straight in the eye. "I will not apologize for the truth. You may have documents, but you will not have peace. Anyone who knows this story will know who you really are." Richard blinked in confusion. His smile faded for a moment, but he quickly regained his self-confidence. "When you grow up, you will understand that the world is not the way you want to see it," he grumbled, turning away. Ethan looked after him and no longer felt either anger or hatred, only emptiness, which was gradually filled with new thoughts, new possibilities. He took a deep breath, feeling that a completely different life was waiting for him. A life he will build himself, without the past dragging him down. He turned and walked away without looking back. And what do you think? Was the judge's verdict fair? Write your thoughts in the comments below the video. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next crazier thing.